Hello folks, welcome back. This one is not a news story of such, more an opinion piece. But honestly, it's really because I'm a bit puzzled, although I'm not. The question I have is, when the first cohort of South African refugees came to America, and in the build-up to that, as the program was uncertain, South Africa's media printed endless, irresponsible story, misdirection, lies, fantasies, and anything possible they could say to disparage the program and disparage the people who qualified as refugees, including endlessly lying to the public, claiming that it was a farmers program, then that it was an Afrikaner farmers program, then that the program, and they still say this today, even though it's a lie, is exclusively for white South Africans. Now, why was that? Well, the story isn't about that. It's about comparing the coverage of the 59ers, as I named them, because there were 59, which no one in the press got correct. I got correct from day one. Why? Because I actually do my research. I don't go to airports and harass people and pester them when their life is in flux and then miscount them and then breathlessly report what someone else reported. No, I actually did my research and confirmed. Also, I confirmed that it wasn't just white South Africans, and it wasn't just Afrikaners, and it wasn't certainly just farmers. But the media to this day still can't bring themselves to admit the truth. In addition to that, as they disparage the refugees, and they seek to disparage the United States, which has generously offered succor and safety to these people who feel their lives are under persecution, they continually call the refugees in quotations. Shall we call the media in South Africa the media? Shall we call the fake journalists in South Africa journalists? Perhaps it's time. So the point of this video is to contrast that with the paucity, the dearth, the lack thereof, am I getting the message across, of coverage of the impact of the 30% tariffs on ordinary South Africans, on South Africa. Now don't get me wrong, I've seen at least one report looking at the citrus industry saying they're in trouble, but the focus had a lot less to do with the tariffs and the failure of South Africa's government to engage U.S. government to reduce those tariffs than it had to do with, well, looking for other markets in Asia. Contrast the obsessive nature of the coverage of refugees with something of real importance. What does it matter to South Africa in the aggregate if 59 South Africans leave the country? 86 leave the country and give up on it every single day without the U.S. refugee program. Has nothing to do with the U.S. refugee program. 86 South Africans depart the country for good every single day because they can't find work. It's not safe because of the racism. But that story's never told. We see virtually no coverage of that in any South African media. But they obsess about the refugees. The refugees have virtually no impact on South Africa at this stage, the few hundred that are here. But the 30% tariffs, well, they're devastating. Or are they? Perhaps they're not devastating. We don't know, because South Africa's media, the fourth estate, fails to do its job to hold the government accountable and to report the truth. They're not doing that. And why is that? Well, I think I have an idea why it might be. You see, most of the refugees are white, and South Africa's media is obsessive about race hustling. Anything that can turn into a race issue, particularly that demonizes white South Africans, 60% of whom were born after apartheid. Well, that's just grist for the mill. That's what it is. They love that stuff. Anytime they can divide people by race, they're worse than the politicians. They'll do it. They'll report breathlessly on race to say that, ooh, the evil white people. So what does that have to do with the other issue? Well, the immediate impact and the place you might have empathy or sympathy is for people who are hit by this. Well, most of the people hit by this are people who own things like farms, orchards, automobile factories, businesses. And of course, many of those people happen to be white. And we wouldn't want to report the suffering or the misery or the financial collapse of white people, even though their collapse, their misery, their suffering is what directly leads, it is the proximate cause of unemployment, misery of other South Africans, white, brown, and black. But you see, the media doesn't want to cover those stories. Why don't we see breathless coverage of how the South African government is failing to reduce the tariffs? Other countries have succeeded. Why don't we have endless stories telling the truth that the United States did not receive a South African trade negotiation for months? For months. And there's only been limited contact between them and Ambassador Greer. Why? Instead of blaming Donald Trump for South Africa's woes and blaming Donald Trump, listening to the lies of the ruling party and its inept foreign minister, telling the people that, well, we've tried to engage the Americans. We've left them a list of counter proposals. How about the press ask why such things had to happen? Where the current state of negotiations are? What's happening? And don't just report on it as a one-off, which is what has happened. Oh, they sent a team last week, and that's it. No follow-up. Why aren't your reporters endlessly digging into this case and trying to find out why? You see, folks, South Africa's economy was already on the crapper before the tariffs. Projected to grow at 0.6 to 0.9% GDP this year. Less than 1%, which is below inflation, which is below population growth. And as we read recently, for 17 years, South Africa has produced fewer jobs than people entering the job market. That's shocking, frightening, and a recipe for social unrest at some point. But that gets virtually no coverage. None. There was one story on that. No one else picked it up. Why? It comes down to one simple factor. Sensationalism. Clicks, selling papers, selling advertising, and the way they use to do that is race hustling. These are shameful people who use race to divide South Africans. You would think that South Africa's on the verge of a race war if you followed the media. It's not. You would think that most South Africans hate Ronaldo Khuz. Not true. Most South Africans don't even know who he is. You would think that most South Africans are ready to pick up pitchforks. They're not. They're angry, they're tired, they're hungry, they're frustrated. But not because somebody's black, or because somebody's white, or somebody's brown, but because of the ineptitude of the ruling party and the complicity of the government of national unity, which seems far more concerned about their perks and privileges than it does about delivering service to South Africans. What say you, South Africa? Do you think I'm onto something here? Do you think the reason that we have endless, breathless, hundreds of articles, news stories, lies, slander about me and others in South African media is because of race? And conversely, the reason we have no stories, virtually no stories on the biggest economic disaster hitting South Africa is because of race? I think it is. What say you, South Africa? Zanzi. Cheers.